All right. Well, thanks for tuning in for another Fireside Tesseract LNO chat. Excited to sit down and have another conversation about innovation in the innovation space. This time we're going to go all the way to Osan Air Base, Korea, where we're going to talk to Technical Sergeant Matt Connelly, who spends some time inside the Innovation Center, along with doing his primary day-to-day duties. So, without further ado, Matt, welcome from the future. Thanks for taking the time to join us today.
My absolute pleasure. I can't wait for this conversation.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to it. You and I have been going back and forth on the text machine here the last few days. So why don't you just walk us through some of the stuff that we've kind of went back and forth about? Introduce yourself, who you are, maybe when you joined the Air Force, your little bit of a journey along the way. And then, of course, really for this chat, tell us when and where and how throughout your career you either have been involved in innovation or when that light bulb turned on.
Or, oh my gosh, what a complicated story. So I've been in the Air Force for 16 years at the moment. And so joined in 2007 and then finally crossed over in 2008. Before that, I lived in Poland. And I didn't finish college. I did about 3 years that first time around. And I was about $100,000 in debt. And so I did what any person would do in my circumstances. I decided to join the French Foreign Legion. And so I'm compressing a heck of a lot of details. But needless to say, that thing veered me off to where I ended up doing meteorite hunting in the outback of Australia. And then I signed up for the U.S. military instead. And I ended up, right before basic training, they had lost some of my paperwork when I was in the DEP program, which was the Delayed Enlistment Program. And I had to spend 4 uncomfortable months with my parents there. So I did what any broke person would do. And then I went to Ireland and I asked a girl to marry me. She said no. And so that really established, like, that was the start of my military journey, is that I was on like a super low of my life, perhaps even typical millennial, as one would perhaps say. And so I pretty much did this career being kind of floating and not really knowing what I wanted to go do with my life. And so if we zoom forward to about 2016, that's when I had a boss, and his name was Joey. Or rather, Joseph Walter. He was a master sergeant at the time, but him and I were roughly the same age. I had joined slightly later than the typical person. And so Joe walks into the office, and then he taps me on the shoulder. He says, "Hey, Matt, you need to go to this 5-6 meeting." So for those of us who don't know, the 5-6 meeting is like this middle tier of usually non-commissioned officers, and they just get together to talk about relevant issues. And, I was quite the worker bee at the time, staff sergeant, and I told him that I couldn't do it. I had too much work. And then my colleague, who was sitting right across from me, his name was Ty McLeod. He also kind of does this little glance thing, then he quickly sits back down and goes back on his computer. So basically, we were not interested in going to this thing. And so he kind of gives me this grin. He was one of those folks that he had a very particular way of articulating himself. And he says, after a short pause, he says, "There's free pizza." And I was like, wait a minute, that changes the equation entirely, right? So both Ty and I end up going, and we get our free pizza. And there was a presentation that was being done. It was kind of like a lunch and learn kind of deal. And on the stage was a gentleman named AJ Keel, or Andrew Keel, and he's currently a chief. I want to say he's either in Japan or in Delaware, if I remember correctly, Dover Air Force Base. And he just mesmerized the crowd. I was like, wow, that person can articulate themselves. And they had a presentation about the power of networking and the techniques to use in order to have a good network, why it's good, that it's the people that we know, not what we know, that kind of stuff. So I come up to him after the fact, and I said, introduced myself and I said, like, I'm really good at SharePoint and I would really like to, get involved with whatever you're working on. And he says, hey, you know what? Why don't you try coming to this next class that I have going on over there? And I remember the day. It was April 21st, 2016. I went to problem identification training. And problem identification training takes us through the first 3 steps of the practical problem solving method as outlined by DAFI 38-401. At the time, it was an AFI, or Air Force instruction. And the scales fell from my eyes. I was like, oh my gosh, the Air Force wants us to improve? What is this magic over here? I need to devote my entire life to this. This is amazing. And at that point, I was just like, okay, I need to switch my degree path. Every single book that I need to read has got to be about this. And that spiraled into my Air Force innovation career, should we say. So I like to plant the flag in 2016 as the year that I entered the innovation space, which is already close to, it's probably the better part of the decade right now. And so I guess as far as that is concerned, I followed the trail of breadcrumbs and then found that everything, all the trails led to complexity science and physics. And so when we had complexity science and physics in our corner, all of a sudden the truth was on our side because we found the cause and effect relationship. And that got me to question the entirety of our Air Force circumstances. And so they eventually saw that the collective leadership at the time. I was stationed at Spangdahlem. When the position opened up to have a wing innovation person, they're like, that's the guy. So I apparently made a name for myself as far as that goes.
Was that in 2016 as well when you entered?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was a very slow. At first it was a very slow progression, but then it skyrocketed upward. And then I got involved in 2017 is when I took the original Greenbelt class. And then after that, I got on the teaching circuit where I was teaching this stuff. And back in 2017, I started reading books like crazy. And so far I just finished book 222 since that journey started. And all of it is just following the trail of breadcrumbs, so to speak. And I would just use teaching as a platform to learn because I could incorporate all of this material from book reading into what we were teaching the students. And eventually I became a certified instructor in continuous improvement and innovation. And that eventually led to when the position opened up, I was the only person that really met those qualifications. So they gave me that, and I became a full-time innovation person in 2020, June the 1st, 2020.
Was that in the same cell, or was that a different position that you moved into?
So the cell didn't exist at the time. The cell didn't exist. It was just this backwater program, so to speak, or just this, additional function that was sandwiched in the wing staff agency. And we were getting after, in all honesty, sometimes I think that we were there because, we were getting after some of the direction in the National Defense Strategy. The National Defense Strategy, if we look in the 2018 National Defense Strategy, that's when innovation is mentioned as a distinguishing factor in what we today call the Great Power Competition. And the distinguishing factor in this case was that it was on page 6 of the National Defense Strategy. And then we zoomed to 2020, the National Defense Strategy of 2020. It's actually on page 1. So the very first page of full text outside of the title page, they mention innovation. And so I was like, gosh, this thing is front and center. So it was right time, right place, right environment. And I think like the dialogue that's happening at the higher levels of the Air Force is very much forward leaning as far as that is concerned. And it's been quite the challenge to bring the bureaucracy kicking and screaming into the 21st century, and even General Brown had noticed that in his going away speech that he had not too long ago, where he talked about how it's like, yeah, it's really, really tough to bring the bureaucracy along. And so part of that is a coalition of the willing and getting on board with that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, it's been a wild ride. It's been an absolutely wild ride.
So let's go back to 2017 then a little bit. Or, you were kind of you were self-teaching yourself a lot of these ideas and frameworks and initiatives and theories. What was that like then as really like almost an unclear role maybe that you were put yourself in? Would you call it that? And what was that evolution like from that 2017 to that 2020 to where it became not even more acceptable, but more championed by the force itself?
Yeah, so the role evolved pretty substantially, and we got more and more attention. And here is one of the interesting challenges, right? Because even though the dialogue that is taking place at the top of our Air Force says we need to do this, like be agile, be innovative, etc., the underlying structure underneath didn't change that significantly. So like we know in physics, right, is that reversion to the mean is a statistical inevitability given a long enough time horizon. It was very difficult because we have this one person, like I was literally the entirety of the innovation function within the 52nd Fighter Wing. And so we had this function. And so a lot of things innovation oriented fell on me. And one of the interesting things about this kind of a situation is that the more success that we have, the more the workload increases in perpetuity. And so then we end up getting bogged down on onesie-twosie projects rather than focusing on the primary unit of value, which is to educate, cultivate, and recognize individuals within our Air and Space Force innovation space, right? To kind of be a shepherd for those folks that want to do something a little bit different than what the typical traditional path is. And so that was a massive challenge that we ended up having. I say we because it was both me and my colonel at the time. I'd gone through a series of two colonels. I've actually been in that position for 3.5 years. And a lot of that happened was because we would win competitions like Spark Tank. So I've been to Spark Tank 3 times so far. And of those 3 projects, one was a first place, one was a fan favorite, one was first place and fan favorite. So that was Project Mercury, the Viper Kit project, as well as Project Arcwater. And the very first one, I had just helped out with the pitch, which was the way we project information. And then the second one, I was the actual project manager. And then the third one, Arcwater, I was the project manager as well. And it was crazy how much a single project can monopolize an entire year's worth of effort. And a lot of that is because these senior leaders and all this other stuff, when they're first getting introduced to this information, we have to lay on a fresh pitch with fresh information. And like we know, I'm sorry I'm rambling here, but like we know, there's a very specific language that we have to use at the 06 level and above, because they have a strategic mindset, right? How does this factor into the great power competition, into the strategic view versus the operational or the tactical view? And at a lot of these projects that we have, I've done about 60 of them so far. A lot of them originate at the tactical level. And at the tactical level, they're more focused on details. And the details are like the piston gasket goes into this wire and it redoes the thing and magic happens, right? And this will be better and everybody will like it, that kind of stuff, right? And that's great, but individuals at the strategic level don't have time for that level of resolution. So they only care about those large strokes. And so it was up to us in the innovation office to translate that into something that is digestible for that 06 level or above, especially at the geo level, right? Because they're even more concerned about the strategic side of things. Wow. I mean, that was quite a journey. And nobody taught me anything. A lot of it was just reading books. And if we bumped into a situation, it was self-research and figuring that kind of stuff out. And oh my gosh, did we make so many mistakes. And I say we, because eventually what ended up happening is we would form teams around a project. So a project would have a person who was working on it. And so we would become a team there. And we together would learn our way up here. But needless to say, it was a very progressive journey that started with this idea that we need to focus on some strategic level initiative and then work our way up slowly. And every success begot much more work. And that's a challenge I still don't think we've figured out quite yet. We'll pass it over to you. I could rant for hours about this stuff.
No. I will say this is rambles are welcome here. Like that was a great progression of, I mean, I've done enough of these conversations, and a lot of it's with the project managers that are still at the tactical level at the base. So hearing you describe the both ends, especially now, I'm at a MAGCOM level, and my job is to take some of those tactical level ideas and, like you said, decide and then reinterpret to show at the upper levels, like, yes, this will help the people you wanted to help. And here's how I alleviate your concerns and mitigate your risk assessment of what you're doing as a leader. So one, if you could remember maybe one or two, how eye-opening, or what was that first experience like when you tried to take a great idea that you truly believed in from the tactical level, and maybe that first lesson of trying to explain that to a higher echelon of the goodness, just weren't able to speak to that language?
Yeah, I remember quite prominently where we were working on the Viper kit, which was the first Spark Tank finalist that we ended up bringing up. And I remember being in a room, it was full of O6s, and all of these O6s, we created this presentation to talk about the details of the project, which again, eventually did end up winning the fan favorite. And as we were in the room, I noticed, I pick up on psychology. Psychology is one of my side hobbies. They were more paying attention to their phones than they were to the conversation there. So that told me automatically that there was nothing valuable that we were talking about at the time. And so that was very meaningful to me, even though, the colonel was very nice about it. He talked to, he was able to usher us through that situation without any major issues. But basically we went back to the drawing board, and then we redid a lot of the stuff to take into account the language that was necessary for that level. And part of that was just sitting down with the colonel and be like, let me know what's on your mind about this stuff,
Yeah.
So that's how we did it. And since that time, I've been very particular about the concept of MISI, which is mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive, and then keeping the information to very digestible amounts that are high potency, and that just means big, broad strokes when it comes to talking about that with the colonels. I'm actually giving a briefing to all the O6s this Monday coming up, and then I created this very concise thing. It's like 1 page long, and then like the amount of slides that go with it is like four slides. One of those slides says the words questions on it, right? So it's just very, very potent, very, very potent stuff that just gets to the point. And I think that's the kind of resolution that we need at the O6 level, because they have so much to deal with, I mean, we think we have it tough, but imagine a wing that has 26 squadrons on the inside, each with their own particular function, each with their own particular set of worries, and everything is important to somebody. And actually, I'm sorry, I'm sidebarring here, but if we take a look at AFI 1-2, which is the AFI that talks about commanders' responsibilities, it breaks it down into those 4 major graded areas. And those 4 major graded areas have to do with resources, with people, with the mission, and then about improving the actual mission itself, right? And then there's actually a quiet 4th one called Commander's Intent, which is like, this is roughly where we want to go, the true north portion of the whole thing. And if we take a look and then we actually count out, I've done this before, if we count out all of the sub areas, the Air Force has 61 number one priorities. And if we think about that for just a second, just in terms of raw mathematics, like that's a recipe for not being focused on anything. And so that's a challenge unto itself, because literally everything's important. People's important, the mission's important, improving the mission's important, resource stewardship is important. So what do we focus on? Everything. And if we look at AFI 1-1, or is it DAFI 1-1 right now, where it's telling us to produce air power anytime, anywhere in airspace and cyberspace, what it's basically asking us to do is do everything all the time, everywhere, always, and then we'll be fine. Like, oh my gosh, I get it, right? We want to cover our 6. But from a physics standpoint, that's impossible. You know, it's so crazy. Like we are too big for our budget, but we're too small for our mission. And that's a fascinating situation to be in. I guess that's where the innovation space comes in, because we're trying to ameliorate some of those more pernicious issues, you know, moving forward in the great power competition.
And you kind of circle back to the innovation and tying it to mission on a day-to-day. And that's something you mentioned that you're balancing now, as you're not directly one hat in an innovation office, tie your team out different projects. So how is it for you now where you're at? On doing both of those type of things and trying to, as you said, prioritize these different types of things that are all number one. So how do you do that? What's it like for you?
That's a really good question, because if we take a look at the book, The Experiment That Succeeded by Dr. Brian Maui. Dr. Brian Maui was the gentleman who created AFWorks. He sat across the table from General Goldfein, and they came up with the name AF, which means Air Force We, that's us. And then RX is the symbol for medicine. So we are the cure for the Air Force kind of deal. And so inside the Air Force, they talk about the incentive structure that we have underneath. And so the incentive structure is that we prioritize individuals who do not fail at their particular job. And innovation by its very nature has failure embedded into it. I would say probably 90% of the projects that we deal with either fail, fade, or freeze over a long enough time horizon, because there are permanent changes of station that are involved. There's familial situation, the energy runs out of steam, there's no money, etc. And so a big portion of them just kind of die off into just a memory. And then eventually there's no institutional memory left of that particular effort, you know? And that's somewhat problematic, because even in our innovation space, and you two may know this as well, is that this is not exactly a promotable thing. If we look at it from that, I mean, not to complain or anything to that effect, but as I do innovation, my board scores don't exactly go anywhere, because even though we're doing stuff that has a massive strategic effect on the European continent or in Asia, that doesn't matter to the traditional system, which still prioritizes functional excellence. And that functional excellence is great, but it's local efficiency versus global effectiveness, right? And then the system doesn't know how to handle some of those actors within the space that can handle that interdisciplinary piece. And the interdisciplinary piece, that's the tough part right there, right? Because then who do we fall under? And then we step on toes, and then there's all these other factors that we have to that are just challenges. They are really challenges. One of the biggest challenges, I'll tell you this, Nate, is that some of the more traditional elements within our air and space forces right now, especially the older that we're in the military, we don't like the concept of blindsiding. I mean, I'm sure we've heard that term before, but blindsiding is this idea that that a person is confronted in a leadership position, is confronted with information, and they don't know anything about it. And that's I guess, a grave sin within the world of whatever. And then in the innovation world, a lot of our ideas are not even mature enough to really get up to that particular level. And then we're scolded for not letting folks know that we were working on this particular thing. And then we're stepping on the territory, especially when it's interdisciplinary. It's like, well, that's a them problem. That's not an us problem. Why are we handling that? Because it's them. And I have encountered this even recently, but it happens, oh my gosh, every single year I step on toes. We step on toes with this whole situation. And that's, again, the old pushing up against the new. It was General Alvin. He actually wrote a post on the Morpheus page. So Morpheus is under the Strategic Studies Group. So they're the think tank that helps think up stuff with innovation within our air and space forces. And he writes a blog post that talks about the tension between innovation and then the traditional way of doing things. And there's this crazy tension between the both of them. And it can take a lot out of us. It really can. It does not do us any favors as far as that is concerned. And yeah, that's definitely something that I still fight. And I think a big plus on that is having a leadership team, or at least a champion that can shield us from that kind of stuff. And so having a good like deputy commander at the wing level or above as an advocate, oh my gosh, does that make a world of difference in this space? Because, you know, folks can attack us, but we can always say, like, go talk to dad. Maybe dad would like it.
Yeah.
You know, because oftentimes we do things on behalf of the wing leadership. And so, of course, we're going to blindside everyone in the middle of the chain of command. And the thing to remember is that we're not working on anything bad. We are literally working on something better than what it's replacing. And that's worthy of scrutiny because we're blindsiding. I'm sorry, I don't buy that argument. It's okay not to know things. It is not a slight on our ability to lead to not know something. It just means that there's far more information than our ability to process. And that's baked into the laws of physics. There will always be imperfections. Second law of thermodynamics.
As you said, trying to move that bureaucracy and getting a champion on your side to be able to, like you said, Dad, please help me. Like,
oh, I'd have been unashamed of using that. I just like, go talk to Dad, go talk, and nobody ever does, right? Because like, what are we really? If we congeal the argument together, what are they actually saying no to? Maybe it's the way it was done. I would guess, but there is no set procedure. Innovation is a messy concept. Like we actually. When the traditional bureaucracy asks us, like, give us a COA, a course of action, or give us, you know, a timeline, or give us an estimated cost, like we don't know most of the time because we don't know the factors that are involved because in most cases, it is a complex issue. A lot of it with localization, with a localization component that will add nuance to that particular set of circumstances, right? And so there's no way to know. And so that is unsatisfying to some elements in our bureaucracy. And there's actually a really good way of telling that. It's if we're familiar with Project Mercury, and Project Mercury, which is from a cooperation between the Innovatriums of Dr. Jeff DeGraff, University of Michigan, as well as Air University. So at the time it was General Hecker, who's now the USAFE and 4-star. We all have different personalities as it is in regard to new and novel stuff, so innovation. And the Air Force has filtration mechanisms. The military in general has filtration mechanisms. Those are the officer training school, those are the academy, the basic military training. And we have these filtration mechanisms, and the people who are most likely to pass through those filtration mechanisms have a specific set of characteristics in their personality that make them more adapt to listening to rules and going getting things done. Like even if we listen to the Airman's Creed, it says, I will not falter and I will not fail. So that promotes a certain kind of personality to pass through that filtration mechanism. And so what we get is a preponderance of that personality type of those engineers and those athletes, as they're known in that framework, those folks who are go-get-em and those folks who are rule-abiding folks, they're the ones who are most likely to pass. So that eventually drips into policy. It eventually drips into the standard operating procedures. The way we do things is a result of the collective psychology of our folks that we have. And that is very tough to maneuver out of, because that's a macro force, and macro always trumps micro, period, end of story, given a long enough time horizon, because it's just an overwhelming force, right? And so we, as little beacons of innovation, we're like a little burst of energy, but that burst of energy is quickly enveloped by the even greater energy of the macro. And so that's something that if we don't have our network, and if we don't have that joint force where we can become a macro of our own, then we're not going to survive in this space, right? We're not going to be able to produce those units of value for our leadership. And then eventually it just goes back down into the very typical tribal way of doing things. I remember, I'm sorry, I'm keep rambling here, but I remember I had just gotten off of 3.5 years of being exclusively innovation. I absolutely loved it. Every moment of it. And I worked more hours than I can count. I would stay late. I would come in early, stay late, all this other stuff. And I remember that when I got to Osan, when I moved here, it was like just hitting the reset button. There was very few people that I talked to who knew anything about innovation. And even when I asked, like, what is innovation? They're like, oh, that's like new stuff, right? And then you're like, no, it's the risk-adjusted application of useful novelty to a value creation process. Like, oh, and then it was so frustrating to be back into the regular career field.
It's tough, and it does go back to the balance. 'Cause and as you've discussed, it is much easier in the structure and the setup that we're in, that we've had for so long, to point to a production and say that it's valuable versus saying, well, here's the innovation space that promised me four ideas and I haven't seen one in 2 years.
Yep.
Right. So, and it's much easier to articulate that.
Yeah. There's a lot of waiting for the stars to align in our space. Whether that's money to drop, contracts to be reviewed. I've even heard ramblings like innovation should just be an outgrowth of contracting, and
like just buying stuff.
Yeah, and there is an application that's called adoption, right? So that's commercial off the shelf in most cases, where there's a dual use for a certain technology. But that's only a part of the puzzle. There's process improvement, there's actual innovation, and then the commercial off the shelf adoption, and then there's actual invention. Invention is where we have someone creating something new and novel to be used in a circumstance that's important to them. Yeah. And 3D printing is a really good example, where we have colleagues of ours who are able to 3D print their way out of an issue, or they 3D print themselves a tool that is very specific to their set of circumstances. And, that's the quiet stuff. It probably doesn't even get quantified. It's probably a one-off kind of deal. We'd love to give it'd probably be pennies on the dollar to get it across the entire enterprise, but it's very difficult for us to promulgate that message beyond the confines of a geographical area, like at a base, right? It's a little bit easier to promulgate things, but then as soon as it gets to enterprise level, we really need the megaphone from our leaders. We really do, because I would say it's almost impossible otherwise,
I do have to throw this question at you, because it's one of my favorite questions in this space to ask people that have been on this journey, and especially for you that it's almost a decade now. You've put a lot of tools in your toolbox along the way. So now you get to go back to 2016 to your younger self, and you get to give yourself one of these tools. What would you give yourself that you didn't know then that you have now?
Read good books. That's a superpower. That's the superpower. It distills an entire lifetime, in many cases, of knowledge. We just have to consume it for like between 6 to 14 hours of reading time, and all of a sudden we get a massive amount of information that helps us in our day-to-day. And I would also say, like, just get on the education train and then don't ever get off, and follow the trail of breadcrumbs as it naturally progresses. And so what we found was that innovation or continual process improvement was first, but then innovation as a concept, right? It's basically monetization of useful value creation. All roads lead to complex system science. All roads are interdisciplinary, right? There's no one thing, right? There's geopolitics, there's physics, there's geography, there's math, there's sociology, psychology, all of these various different disciplines, and then all of it plays a role into innovation. So I would say read good books would be the number one advice. Get started on that early, and then get on the education train and just roll with it. And I think that does a world of good, opens doors. And and I would also add one extra thing: get on LinkedIn and join the conversation as quickly as possible, because that conversation, I have received more temporary duty yonders, TDYs, that off of LinkedIn than I ever have off the AFNet. And there's been more conversations that are meaningful within our air and space forces that I've had on LinkedIn or as a result of LinkedIn than I ever have doing anything government oriented or on the AFNet side of things. And I think the reason why is because the median has a lot less friction than what we have on the AFNet, right? Because we're not, like folks like us, we're not necessarily married to a computer terminal all the time. So we have our cellular telephones with us. And then it's a space that like-minded individuals gather. We've got Slack and we've got LinkedIn. That right there is it. And connect with good people. Like I got Deanna Myers. She's a Pathfinder that we have here. We've got Kevin Walton. We've got Jason Courtois. Both of those two are Tesseract LNOs, like the liaisons. We got Ryan Amador. He's an ex-NASA guy. He was the staff sergeant, but he's ex-NASA. And an absolutely smart individual, right? And our Air Force doesn't know how to handle these individuals necessarily. We even came up with this really cool thing called the Unicorn Code of Military Justice, which was this concept of, how innovators are supposed to behave in certain circumstances.
I love it. That's awesome. All right, as we wrap up, tell us one thing you're working on now that you're really, really excited about.
Yeah, sure. So we are in the running for the Ether Sprint. We're a finalist, and we have a project called Project Weapon, which started over 2 years ago. And it started with a individual coming to AFREP, the Air Force Repair and Enhancement Program, and they were asking us to fix a component for one of their capabilities, which was to test out weapons. And as we were looking at the whole circumstance, we're like, oh my gosh, this thing must have, evolved over years and years and years to be this ugly thing. It was basically 9 different components that were used just to provide power for aircraft testing, for the weapons testing. And so we were able to take a look at that situation and then slim it down by over half. So we kicked out about 57% of the components that were necessary for this capability. And then we also decreased the weight by a third, and we were able to decrease the price. And so basically, instead of taking up 2 pallets on a C-130, which is about 1/5, we were able to go down to a singular pallet to have this capability. And so what that does for our mission planners is that it gives them more room to take tools, equipment, water, fuel, ammunition, and it's literally a permanent benefit for a $3,000 cost that could be easily done within the Air Force Repair and Enhancement Facility program, confines. That's
awesome. Well, Matt, I just want to say, thanks again. Man, just listening to you for the last hour, I could probably listen to you for a few more hours. I love your passion. I am thankful that we have people like you in the Air Force doing these types of things. And just thanks again for chatting with us today.
Thank you. I'm happy to come on anytime and to talk about any of the efforts that we're doing, and also some of the more abstract things like the bigger picture macro stuff. So I'm very much in tune to the conversation that we're having across the Air Force. So my absolute pleasure. It was an absolute pleasure, Nate, John. It was an absolute pleasure to interact with both of you. And look forward to the next time.
Awesome. Thank you.
Any references to trademarked, copyrighted, or protected products or services, such as books, movies, or businesses, are used here for the limited purpose of education and professional development of Air Force Airmen. If you have any questions, please contact us at www.tesseract.af.mil.